I'd like to welcome you to this business discussion on, I think, one of the topics, the major topics that is facing India today in relation to its future development, which is data and how data is accessed, how it is used, and data localization. These are critical questions, I think, that are actually facing India at this present moment in time. UK IBC and the Pali Foundation have been preparing research together with UK and Indian stakeholders on this question. And this discussion is to further enhance and enrich that research, which will then be used to discuss with the government going forward. So what we want to do in this session is to have an interactive discussion amongst those stakeholders who are seated at the front and those stakeholders who are also on the stage with myself. And we're delighted to have Tanya from Times Now to moderate this session for us. So if I can just briefly introduce the people on the panel, and then I'll mention some of the people who are also in the audience who will be participating. So on my far right is Kshitij Shah from 314 Capital, which is a venture capital firm out of Bangalore, investing in early stage startups. We have Ron Mobed CEO of Relics Elsevier, one of our largest technology companies out of the UK. We have the CEO and founder of MobiKwik, who is one of India's fast-growing fintech payment platforms. We have Larry Stone, who is the chairman of BT here in India. And we have the CEO and founder of Vidrona, which is a UK-based big data analytics company focusing on agri-tech. And in the audience, we have, contributing also to this discussion, we have People.io, we have TVS Logistics, we have Equinity, we have Aviva, we have two fintech startups of various focuses. One is Acorn Oak North, the other is HEDB. One focusing on commercial lending, the other focusing on trade finance. And we have other companies as well. I'd like to start with contextualize this by starting with shamelessly plagiarizing a quotation that I heard last night, which I think sums up the question of data. And Nick, you're sitting there in the front, so it's you I'm going to be plagiarizing from, which is, data is not the new oil. All right? Oil is finite, whereas data is infinite. And I think that really contextualizes what the subject that we're talking about. India will become one of the world's largest and richest data countries in the world very, very shortly. Aadhaar, GST, IoT, all are creating a vast lake of data which can be used to develop social, economic policies and programs that are going to make and enhance life in India and beyond India in this century. Obviously, and quite rightly, India is looking at the legislative framework in which data access and data privacy is going to be treated within this jurisdiction. The issue, though, is there are no common themes, there are no common procedures, there are no common products globally against which this jurisdiction is developed. In the US has a somewhat laissez-faire attitude to data privacy and data access. Of course, there are constitutional amendments which impact on their processes. On the other hand, you have China, which has a form of data nationalism which is driven by internal security issues. And then the third element, if you like, the third exemplar, is GDPR in the US, in the UK and Europe, which is a consent-based system. Current examinations and discussions around the legislative framework here in India would indicate that India is looking at a more prescriptive, qualified consent, qualified access type of framework. And I think the debate and question that we're all looking at is how does this operate? How can we operate under this system which sits somewhere between Europe and between the Chinese system? I think that there's been a lot of debate recently on data localization. Clearly, the pronouncements that have come out of the RBI have stimulated a lot of discussion. But I think at the same time, there is a lot of questions around what is data localization. And I think we have to sensitize that term and look at it in the context of our own businesses, what those businesses do, the size of our companies, whether we're domestically focused, whether we're multinational, etc. And that is where the debate should be focused. Ultimately, though, and from speaking on behalf of businesses, I think that the debate should be less about process and more about outcomes. And I think it's critical to discuss legislative frameworks and data access and data processing and data localization within the context of ease of doing business. Outcome-based focus rather than process. And why do I say that? Because if you look at trade flows and data flows that currently exist within the world, there is a high correlation. And that's logical, because data and metadata follow trade, and trade and metadata are created by trade. Indeed, if you look at how trade and data flows at the moment, you can see that going forward, these changes will mirror the changes in trade. So currently, we are expecting a change from north-south trade to south-south trade. Currently, Europe, if you measure data volume in terms of terabits per second, is the richest and most vibrant area of data at the moment. Currently, Europe as a region has 128.1 terabytes per second volume, versus in Asia at the present moment at somewhere at the region of 38.1, putting it third behind the United States. I believe that actually that position will narrow and indeed probably will reverse as India and Asia come to the fore. So when you're looking at trying to anticipate frameworks, anticipate change, anticipate localization, you have to bear in mind the strategic changes that are going to occur. It's against that background, it's against those parameters that I'm looking forward to this discussion. So, Tanya, over to you.
Thanks, Richard, for setting the context. So what I thought we could do is we could sort of deep dive right into it. I'll start by asking everybody on stage here for their opening remarks. Of course, I have pointed questions for them, and then we'll sort of take the discussion forward. Please feel free to sort of jump right in. I've got the unenviable task of sort of trying to get everybody's word in. Larry, let me begin by asking you, and I'm going to sort of take off from what Richard was talking about. The format and framework of the data protection bill sort of positions itself, as Richard was saying, within the principles of qualified consent and qualified access. So somewhere straddled, between the EU GDPR on one hand, and then you've got the Chinese national security approach. What is your own assessment of the draft policy that's been put out?
Okay, well, that's a pretty straightforward, simple question for this time in the morning. So, where shall I start? I mean, take it from a broader business perspective. I'll try and be brief. Two things. BT is, we think, difficult to measure, in the top 10 of moving data around the world. Point one. Point two is India is by far our second biggest footprint in the world, with over 10,000 people, probably double that contractors. And why are we here? We're here for two reasons, really. Perhaps three. One is the talent and the people. Secondly, the research capabilities, and we're announcing something later on today with an institution from Bangalore in that area. Thirdly, the scale of the market linked to the scale of data management. So those are probably just some parameters. And what we're looking for as a company which moves data around the world, handles personal data, handles anonymized data, trying to grow in the context of fast-moving technology, is a thing which I think almost impossible for policymakers, but something we ought to try and aspire to, perhaps with through the organisation globally, which Elizabeth Denham, the UK Information Commissioner, chairs, the panel of data protection regulators globally, is minimum necessary differentiation between digital data protection, data security, and trade flow regimes, allied to, where there is differentiation, maximum possible explanation. And as early notice as possible. In the India Data Protection Bill, for example, which I think is an interesting and positive step forward, there are a number of areas which need to be teased out and understood over the next few months or so. One is this sort of new category or new bucket of data called critical data. The overall shape of the Data Protection Authority, perhaps, is another area. There are about 3 or 4 areas which I think need teasing out.
Ron, same question to you. For Indian and global stakeholders, what's the likely impact? The fact that, that the draft sort of provisions for consent to the extent that data sovereignty is paramount.
Thank you very much for the question. Let me answer from the perspective of my company, RELX Group. We are a UK top 20 listed company by market capitalization, and we focus on using data analytics and artificial intelligence in a business-to-business context for a variety of sectors, ranging from healthcare to academic research, legal, financial services, and agriculture. So we are not a business-to-consumer organization, and our business model is not through advertising. So that said, the first point I'd like to make is that, as you heard this morning from Amitabh Kant and others, data is a huge opportunity. And so from the perspective, whether it's around outcomes or understanding the social benefit, the step changes that data can bring to areas such as health, we have to consider what the opportunity is first. And any regulatory environment needs to create the framework where that opportunity can be best realized. At the same time, the misuse of data helps absolutely nobody, neither in a business-to-business context nor on a personal level. So the balance there is to make sure we're creating the right environment for encouraging the data opportunity, while at the same time preventing misuse. The second point we'd like to make is that, as you heard earlier from Elizabeth Denham, the environment around technology and data is changing, and so the regulatory environment also needs to be able to keep pace with these changes and to be strong. And the last point is that, having put in place intelligent regulations, the regulator itself needs to be strong. A regulator really needs to understand the subject deeply, and so it's very encouraging to hear this morning the idea that in the UK they're bringing on academics specialized in aspects of data to make sure that the regulator authority is strong. Those 3 components together will create the right balance between unlocking the power of data for social good, while at the same time protecting individuals and society against misuse.
Speaking of, protecting individuals and their privacy, and I think that's pretty much caught everybody's fancy. So, Bipin, let me ask you, tech companies often have to sort of toe the line. in that light, how easy is this draft regulation going to be? On one hand, you have to protect your consumers' privacy. On the other hand, perhaps you'll have to push back, the government's demand, sometimes perceived as creating a backdoor.
So see, I'm a founder of MobiQuick. We have about 100 million users in India, and we are focusing on creating a digital financial services platform for the middle income customers in this country. And obviously, data lies at the heart of our business in terms of our understanding, who the customers are, what their financial needs are. And as an entrepreneur, I would be the last one to advocate more regulation. We are already regulated, by RBI and by other regulators. But look, I think the context today in India is quite different. In India has been a very, very open digital economy. We've had all global corporations coming up, setting up business here. The Google of India is Google, the WhatsApp is WhatsApp. So whether you look at communication, whether you look at commerce, and financial services, one sector where there's a lot of Indian companies. I feel that there's two things, that there are clear trends emerging globally which need to be addressed, and this data privacy and protection law addresses that. One is that in the internet and technology world, monopolies have been emerging. Companies which were into communication went into commerce, and companies which are into commerce went into financial services. There's talk of Google and Amazon getting into and becoming a bank. If you see some of the largest Chinese companies, that's what they are doing. They started from commerce, they went into financial services, some of them do communication. Now, it's the same customer, and all the different kinds of data of that customer, right, is being shared and being utilized to create businesses. So clearly there is a need for a framework where consumers, customers can have some form of consent. I would not argue what would be the extent of that consent, but it has to be something that has to be taken into account in order to build these businesses. And I think that is what will allow, at least from an Indian perspective, from a country like India, to have a situation where there are no monopolies. One of the things that we should aspire to is that India does not try to become a digital colony, right? For larger global corporations with their advantage of market and advantage of capital, right? And access, creating tech monopolies and thereby data monopolies.
Right, Bipin, but those who are perceived as monopolies, and I'm presuming, you won't say it, let me say it, I'm presuming you're saying the Facebooks and the Amazons. In America we're seeing a big call for them to be broken up. Do you really think that's the solution? Because somewhere are we not also then, stifling tech innovation by calling for that?
Not really.
Okay.
I'm no one to argue for Facebook to be broken up or Amazon to be broken up. I'm just saying from a context of this policy that we're debating today,
yeah,
and specific to a country like India, where we agree that there's a large amount of data that is being generated, which is private, which is useful, and which cuts across different business segments. There needs to be a framework to evaluate first which are the businesses or which are the companies which have maximum access to data. Would you want a situation in India where a private corporation or a handful of private corporations have access to all the data?
Yeah.
So clearly that is not a desirable situation from any point of view, not just from a security point of view, but also from an economic development point of view. As we know, worldwide, the biggest innovation will come from smaller companies, tech companies, yes, right? And I think the job of the regulator should be to support and enhance that innovation, and that will happen only when there is a level playing field, when there is a fair competition, and I think this addresses one of those issues.
Okay. Shadish, let me ask you, and you have your ear to the ground when it comes to the startup ecosystem. How are startups sort of preparing for this draft bill, whether it's notice and consent requirements or the purpose and collection of the limitations, where consent has to really be specific. So, to that extent, you're not going to be able to repurpose the data, which one would imagine somewhere could curtail, your the way startups are looking to maybe monetize the data?
Well, it depends a lot. Let me tell you how the companies are actually taking it. Some of the companies that I have met are taking a very proactive approach because of the precedents of GDPR and other concerns that have come up in the past couple of years around the sensitivity of data, right? All of them take consent. There is a thin line between consent taken on an application basis for the company providing the service and consent taken on the operating system level, right? Whether you're on iOS or Android or any other equivalent around the world. It is very tough for the consumers to understand where their consent is exactly going, right? So the companies are actually investing in enough consumer awareness and education of that consent and what it means. At the same time, they're also educating their own consumers so that they provide adequate consent for continued services and innovations that the companies like MobiQuick can continue to provide to them, right? Building on top of their existing data. So there is enough proactive approach that is going on from the ground realities of it.
Ashutosh, let me ask you about data localization. When the Twitter CEO, Jack Dorsey, he was in town last month, I think it was. And when somebody in a town hall asked him, what are your thoughts on data localization? He said, hey, in the era of cloud, that's not a relevant debate. The debate shouldn't be about where your data is stored, but what companies are doing with your data. How would you respond to that?
I mean, it's an interesting question. Thank you very much. And as a Vidrona, I would just cite some example. I totally agree with this today's world. Saying data localization does not really make much of a sense, but there is something which we need to consider is critical data, like critical assets. Those are something which we need to focus. And now you need to refine the data in the granularity. And when you go with the more in top, you basically are trying to extract the main features from the data. So you're talking about metadata. So by that, you're not losing any detail about the particular customer or an entity, but with the metadata, you are quite good enough in terms of using machine learning or AI, where you can then combine that to make it like a new intelligent data. Because I totally agree with the fact that when data comes into a, like let's say that data, of course, is not the new petroleum, as Richard was saying. I actually give a different context. I always say that, consider that data is an inflow, and you have a refinery with an alchemy in that attached. So instead of having a finite output, you have multiple outputs, and within the outputs, you can play with the multiple alchemy things, and you can generate a much more newer data with a new added value. And that, again, you cannot say that it's localized. It, again, gets used, readily available for everyone. For instance, as Vidrona, being as a space tech-enabled company for non-space tech industries, and being based in UK, we are doing loads of projects all across the globe. Because the fact is that once this metadata, which we get, can be utilized for the benefit for the rest of the across the globe. So the word for localization does not hold true for any of such kind of data. Data is literally global. We need to follow the framework which can enable that the data, the granularity which you're looking, that needs to be just say that that is more local. So if you're looking at a company which is based in one geographical location, that will be called localized data because they are looking at the raw data. Let that be there. But the metadata becomes an international citizen flying around everywhere.
So are you saying to us then that India should reconsider this push towards data localization?
Not just India, but I would say that there should be a framework, but definitely not in the context that it should be just hampering the growth of different opportunities. Because by going for a very strict policy, I mean, as an entrepreneur, I would never want that to be there in place. And same as Bipin was mentioning as well, because by restricting that kind of thing, you're never going to achieve much more bigger picture. Because imagine the thing when mariners, they were calculating, noting all the star positions for hundreds of years. until recently we realized that actually it was much, much worthwhile for localization. And now it has not just an implementation in the marine industry, but also in other shipping industries, for logistics, and so many things are coming in, and even for airline companies and so on. So that's why I'm saying that going with the push that it needs to be localized by having a server saying that it is based in one country, yes, keep the high resolution data or those which are specific to a company or a country, that needs to be in one place, but then metadata should be allowed to go up in one next level where entrepreneurs, new technology or technopreneurs, I would say, can utilize and make better use out of it.
Okay. So, Richard, you said to us that data is not the next oil, but the fact is that data needs to be refined, valued, traded, and hopefully we're not going to see data wars. But from your vantage point, how have you seen, and somebody who has this, his skin in the game as well, how have you seen the law here in India sort of evolve and and catch up? How would you compare to what exists, the rules of the game in the UK?
I think you have to approach each jurisdiction looking at the actual culture of the country in which the framework is being rolled out. I think that there is still an ongoing and active discussion here as to how data is going to be treated. And I think that you've heard from both Vipin and Ashutosh in relation to critical data. And there are areas where there are national priorities and priorities that override. But I think this key question of what is metadata, how do you treat the metadata, are there areas where actually there is no necessity to regulate flows of data? These are, I think, debates and questions that have to go forward. Clearly, there is a timetable in relation to the passage of legislation. I think that at the same time, there are uncertainties around some of the details of that legislation that I think people should get a little bit more comfortable with before that legislation is actually taken through. But ultimately, you can't take, I don't think it's fair to take the Chinese model or the European model or the US model and apply it in India. India is a totally different country with vast numbers of different aspects that impact on it. But I think there has to be an active dialogue between stakeholders in order to influence that.
Okay. Speaking of stakeholders, let me ask Ms. Elizabeth Denham here. We are, of course, at the India-UK FutureTech Festival. How do you see the UK and India sort of collaborate better, especially on the grassroots level, to potentially look at disruptions in the digital ecosystem?
Well, this is a great discussion. Is this on? It's a great discussion, a rich discussion, particularly about the bill. So I'm fascinated with that. From a grassroots level, there's so many connections in the business community between the UK and India, and I want to promote some of the open source tools that the ICO has on our website, which are about privacy by design, they're about security by design, and I think they would be useful to Indian companies and other companies that are doing business in India to have a look at our tools, best practices. But at this festival, I'm learning a lot, but I think what's really important as you go forward is to define the outcomes that India wants to achieve in the legislative framework. And you have the advantage of taking the best of breed, take the best out of the existing framework that works for the cultural and legal community and apply that to your law. But I want to emphasize one more thing, and that is the need for India given the importance of the tech industry, to have a strong, independent, well-resourced, well-profiled organization to do this work. Because you really need to have innovation and the need to balance innovation and privacy baked in to the role of the Data Protection Authority. So that's so important. And the regulator also needs to be digitally able to do the work. So that goes to the powers of the regulator to be able to seize digital assets, to be able to forensically examine them, to be able to have the power to look behind the curtain or under the bonnet, to look at algorithms and evaluate whether they're fair. So there's a large toolkit that a new regulator in India really needs to have. And I think also innovative tools like the ability to run a sandbox for the regulator to look at new services and new ways of delivering services for assurance. Thank you.
Let me ask you, Mr. Arvind Gupta. You know, I'm going to go back to the data localization debate, and just to sort of quote, from the bill and what the need really is. It's basically proposing that, data fiduciaries store at least one serving copy of personal data on a server or data center located in India. Now, Mr. Gupta, one would imagine that that's been sort of baked in to give law enforcement, easy access to the data. But do you somewhere believe that maybe that's also sort of curtailing the cross-border flow that's really fundamental to, the growth of the global economy?
So, good morning. I'm going to comment on what Elizabeth has said and what Bipin has commented and a lot of others have talked about, Richard including. I think fundamentally, you have to look at it from the India's perspective of the whole data empowerment and privacy architecture that we're trying to put together as a very different, from a very different lens, first of all. There is no GDPR equivalence in India. There is no Chinese equivalence in India. India is defining its own model. Number one. And I like what Bipin has been saying, or Richard said, we are a very diverse and different digital economy than anywhere else in the world. And I think we need to appreciate that. Number one, we have digital natives who are about 500 million, people who use the online world very actively. But India's digital economy has another model of people, for example, who use Aadhaar, and their data is getting used, and they are, in a way, in an assisted model in the digital economy. They avail of a lot of digital services without themselves being online. So there's a vast diversity in India which does not exist anywhere else. So the data architecture that needs to be built, enabled by a lighter regulation, as this whole draft bill that is going through, needs to take care of this diversity of the user base. So it's a people up architecture rather than a top-down architecture. That's the fundamental difference, which basically means it's minimalistic. It takes into account a right balance between societal impact, privacy, availability, and innovation. And every geography's, every economy's need for that innovation and societal impact and balancing that is going to be different. India is on a much, much different, way different path. I mean, from a very, very data-poor nation, we have become one of the top data-rich nations. All the platforms that have been mentioned, India is in the top 1 or 2 in the world in producing the data exhaust. And whether you give the example of Twitter or Facebook or WhatsApp, I mean, India is going to be the top 1 or 2 market for any of those platforms, and even the Chinese ones. So I think we have to look at it in a very different context, number one. Number two, our outcomes, and I'll comment on the process of the data bill that we are talking about. I think there has been a big debate before and after the debate. It's been the biggest crowdsourcing effort that has ever been done. Just to share with you, we right now, after the draft bill was put online, more than 800 plus submissions have been given and suggestions have been given after that. So it's biggest impact of participatory governance in that it's taking the account and view of almost everybody, both in India and overseas, people who are players in India. Three, you talked about data localization. I view it as, and this is my personal view, as more of an issue of access, an issue of whether it's for law enforcement or for taxation. And I think establishing the governance is also very important. Something that I think a few panelists talked about. Where we are in a global world, whether it's law enforcement is one part, but apart from law enforcement is the issue of permanent establishment of the business. Where are they benefiting from that data, and whether they are being able to contribute back, both from a tax perspective or not, but also from a governance perspective. Today we have platforms which probably don't even have an office in India, have no accountability. So by establishing some sort of data residency, there can be a correlation with that. Right now there is enough cloudness or grayness of where those businesses are located. So I think there are multiple issues at play: taxation, privacy, law enforcement, societal impact, and how do you know, and then innovation on top of it. I'll just conclude with this. You know, we're talking about health, we're talking about credit. There are a lot of credit startups, you said. India just announced MSME credit under 59 minutes, an approval online. What is it based on? It is no longer driven by phone banking. It is driven by data banking. GST, income tax, your account details on consent. If you share based on certain algorithms, somebody can rate you, an algorithm can rate you. Of course, it has to be fair and biased and transparent and tell you whether you are, approved, pre-approved for credit or not. So I think there's a paradigm shift, there's a leapfrogging, and that's all based on a data and digital economy that we are going forward with.
I think just very interesting point of it, because of the fact that, you know, when all this discussion is going on, what I see as and then company-wise, there's a lot of regulation focusing all about the raw data. There is no one talking about a regulation which is post the data. And that's where the entire communication or the conversation is actually getting in. And this is making a big difference, because it has to be a regulation which is for raw data, what is for metadata, then automatically, as what you just mentioned, all those points would be covered, like, you know, taking into consideration the taxation, the data flow, or monetizing, how the companies are monetizing that. But that has to come with a framework, because recently I was at Oxford University discussing with my ex-colleagues, and speaking to them, we were trying to see that how the regulatory changes can come, where the data localization is the core of it, but then it is enhancing the opportunities as well. So that's what I would say in terms of the localization regulation, which is not only for the raw, but also for what is being done post that. That would make a big difference. And that framework is what I think we should all focus on, rather than just focusing on raw data, raw data. Yeah, raw data, you're collecting. I mean, in last decade, we have generated more than 80% of the data all across the globe. And if by putting a lot of regulation on the raw data, we are only, for example, you just cited, you quoted on the draft bill, where they want to keep another copy of it. I am saying definitely, just to keep, but then you see, you're also doing a duplicacy of the data. You're trying to maintain another database for another database, and that's basically adding up, an additional load on several aspects. Yeah. So,
okay, so I'm just going to broad base this, and I'd like to sort of point my next question to Mr. Dinesh from TVS Logistics. We heard Mr. Amitabh Kant talk about innovative and sustainable disruption when it comes to urban mobility. How are you seeing, again, from your vantage point, what we're seeing in the India digital data ecosystem? How do you see, things change from your landscape?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's very interesting conundrum that we have in India, right? On one side, we are trying to talk about building new infrastructure, but at the same time, are we really able to utilize the existing city infrastructure as well as the mobility infrastructure? So I think what data is actually showing us already is that there is huge underutilization in terms of being able to, so to say, utilize better. So I think the innovation has got to be in terms of doing what I may call a multimodal connect within a city or a last mile connect within a city. If I look at typical transportation solutions, I think the biggest challenge we have is in terms of knowing where there is a bottleneck in the last mile. And no city has been planned with the last mile in mind with today's, the population requirements as well as consuming requirements. So going back, I think the important thing we are speaking about here is innovation has got to be at the bottom level. And for that, data is the only thing which is going to give us a solution or an option to really be innovative. How do we use that? I think that I would say has got to be localized, meaning the mindset has got to be localized for local solutions.
Just taking off from there, you talked about innovation, but I also wanted to talk about sustainable disruption. And so I'm going to, ask Luke Nicholson from, Carbon Culture. Luke, explain to us a little bit about, what your company does, because I think, everyone would be interested to know how we can better utilize data to also provide sustainable solutions, good for the environment.
Sure, yeah. So Carbon Culture, we use data, we help large organizations, whose actions have a population scale impact on the environment, to improve their environmental practice, to use carbon more efficiently, to produce less harmful environmental impacts. And there's a few communities in the UK that do that. There's a tech for good community, a clean tech community, who've all been working on this kind of agenda for a few years now. I think what we found through our research, what a lot of other similar companies have found, is that to make civic goods available, that relies on a collaboration between policy and businesses, and also citizens and consumers. And to do that, what we've been doing and what we find works really well is joining together technology and design, both of them, which requires both insight, the kind of insight that we can get from using data, and trust as well. And we need the trust of citizens and consumers in order to make civic goods available. Technology is a really important part of developing that, and the regulatory landscape, I think, has been very helpful in the UK. But also there have been challenges, I think. One of the opportunities that I think it will be really worthwhile to look at carefully in developing a regulatory framework here is how to allow regulators to keep up with the agility and the speed of corporate and business actors there's such a huge asymmetry, I think, in the speed at which businesses can operate. It's very difficult for regulators to keep up. The mix of open data and appropriate protections, I think, is difficult to balance, but it's well worth balancing. I think as regulators go down that path, it's really likely that they'll discover that there are unintended consequences of the policy decisions that they make. Being able to respond really quickly to those unintended consequences and to be able to keep up with markets as they develop, I think is going to be really valuable. Something that I think operates in the UK, which is worth being mindful of here, is whereas we and all over Europe, people are chasing informed consent, we still have broadly uninformed consentors. There are citizens who really don't know what they're consenting to, what the meaning of data, metadata, or derived value from metadata all are, and what the meanings of their consent is. In providing for civic goods, for civic good outcomes, I think we found that technology has a really key role to play in joining up the consent of business, the consent of policymakers, and the consent of citizens, consumers. And that can only really operate successfully in an environment where the regulators are looking at their policies in respect of the civic good, such that the permissions that businesses have from regulators are based on the outcomes that society wants, and that's at the core of the decisions and the policies that are made.
Thanks. I'm going to go next to, sorry, did someone have, yeah.
Yeah, could I just make a point about something that's come up 2 or 3 times but wasn't really expanded upon, and that's the question about algorithms. Mm-hmm. We've talked a lot about data, but I think it was from the floor and then one other comment that some of the issues around regulation actually flow into the nature of the algorithm. We know that there is potential opportunity for bias, either intentional or unintentional in the algorithms, and these have potentially at least as greater an impact as the underlying data ownership itself. At the moment, as a field of academic study, this area, which could include ethics in artificial intelligence, is relatively underexplored. There are very few academic papers on this subject. It's just starting off. If you look at where investment in research in artificial intelligence is at the moment, it's mostly in the technology. We released a report actually today about this. China is by far and away the largest producer of academic papers on artificial intelligence. As it happens, the United States is number 2 and India is number 3. And people are talking about the power of India and the size of its market. So it's number 3 in academic research. Actually, if it was combined with the UK plus India would be very close to the United States in academic research in AI. If we combine that research and then start thinking about the ethics around artificial intelligence as well, there could potentially be a very powerful axis between the two countries to contribute to this field.
Thanks.
I would like to add to that, actually, a couple of things that have been brought up. You brought up the conception of data being curtailed for cross-border exchange. It is important to understand that the law is requesting data residency to an extent, but it's not creating an additional burden on companies. As a technologist, I can tell you all multinationals and even domestic companies operating in the country are best served to keep the data closest to their customers. So content delivery networks have edge nodes already available, and most of the companies already use it. So it's not a very big ask. Yes, there need to be additional processes defined and application changes to be made, but they are still, from a technology perspective, possible. The government does have to consider giving enough amount of time for businesses to reduce that burden and not put a very short time frame of compliance on it, right? That is point number one. The second point I wanted to make, which our guest really brought up, in terms of interacting with a lot of multinationals and multiple stakeholders, including the citizens of different countries, it is important to think about the concept of data trusts, where ownership is not centralized, right? Because data is being generated and contributed to the public domain for civic services, as well as multiple other things, in a democratic fashion around the world. It is important that governments and the data protection authorities work out a way to establish common data trusts, principles on which cross-border exchange of data is mutually agreeable, and all participating stakeholders can take advantage of the derived data that comes out of it as well.
Larry, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, thank you. I tend to agree with that, because we've had a sort of a stop-start approach to trying to get mechanisms in place for facilitating cross-border data flows, like data adequacy agreements, the plurilateral debates in trans-border data flows in the TISA agreement and the TPP, for example. From my point of view, one thing is, if you look at most businesses, I suspect that you look at the economics of data, and what you're interested in is minimum appropriate regulation for data privacy and a forensic approach to regulation elsewhere. But on top of that, I think we need to recognize that the politics of data is moving very rapidly. And it's very complicated, because things are happening which are at a seismic level, which are unexpected, like the impact of manipulation of data on political discourse in major democracies, the impact of manipulation of data in relation to terrorism and counterterrorism and security, and also some nascent work on the impact that social media and access to technology is having on the development of children in terms of their communication skills. So these things are really, really fundamental things: security, education, democracy. So all those things mean that governments are keenly interested in that. I think the thing is to focus very much on what's appropriate and necessary, but also to recognize that the free flow of data is what drives the economy and business growth, and the ability therefore to spend on things like health and education. So I think it's setting that balance, which is keenly difficult.
We've also got representation from the Fintech industry. So I just wanted to call upon Yugal Kishore Yadav. Is he here? Yes. Yeah, and also Bill Ashlock of AGTB. Is he here? Yes, great. So we could just hear from you folks on how things have evolved in the fintech industry.
Sure. So first, to give a background as to why data is really crucial for fintech. So our platform, Acon Machine, Oak North, we started it in UK 3 years back. Through machine learning, data lakes, and essentially assessing a lot of data to help give the middle-sized companies credit on time. I know somebody said that we are doing 59 minutes for MSMEs in India, but actually if you look at the middle-sized companies, which would be 4 million revenues to up to, let's say, 100 million revenues, which are anyways the core of the engine of economies anywhere. Typical banks take, 3 weeks, 4 weeks to give them loans. And those are the guys who are really driving your economy. Using data, using artificial intelligence, using machine learning, using metadata and algorithms over it, we've been able to reduce that for our platform to 1 to 2 weeks, which is massive. And again, coming on to the localization part of it, which is like a really good topic to talk about. Our platform was once trying to approach somebody in Germany, and I think there's something where the policymakers also need to take a note. GDPR overall does not really say something about localization, but when you go to countries specifically into Europe, Austria has their own layer upon GDPR, Germany has their own layer upon GDPR. So just because probably Germany is very averse to getting their data out of the country, they could be losing out on their SMEs getting faster loans from our platform. So these look like right now, very little ramifications, but over time and over, growth, these could be really big.
That's a great point you made. Bill, would you sort of respond to that? What is the pragmatic approach, in a case like this?
I'm going to talk in context of Anglo-Gulf Trade Bank and what we're doing. We're in a B2B serving corporate customers in an all-digital bank proposition. And the first thing we've done differently is the recognition of who owns the data and what is our role with that. And so instead of viewing a thing of acquiring data from a customer, is really recognizing that customer ownership and viewing our role to collaborate with them to deliver better and different services. I think the points raised earlier about raw data and how a machine looks at data is extraordinarily relevant. We're concerned traditionally about private identity and information used to target. I'm much more worried about what we use to influence, what we use to respond and anticipate. The machine doesn't care about our traditional name. They recognize us in very different ways. Corporations and serving other corporations need to actually collaborate together that we can recognize credit risk in a very different manner, more on a transaction level, as opposed to arbitrary who the buyer and the seller are and what's going on in between them, and really look into the future where data residency is less of an issue, but more who's accessing the data, for what reason and what purpose, what is the intent, and are we willing to have a social contract with our customers that says, this is our intent, this is our willingness to be transparent, and this is our willingness to be accountable for what we're doing with what is ultimately yours. And the challenge is, how do we unknow what we know? And the metadata and what follows in those algorithms, even if I have the right to be forgotten, the machine will still recognize me. They will still be able to respond to me because of my unique digital signature. And in a way, even I don't recognize, and corporations don't recognize. And I'm actually far more worried in the future, and I think the challenge of the legislation is to move beyond raw data and to move in a more iterative fashion of learning and growing and actually protecting the citizens from what right now we cannot imagine.
It's like someone who said that about Spotify, that Spotify knows you better than your husband probably does, thanks to the algorithm. Let me point my next question to Sanjay Verma of G4S. Sanjay, you've been, sort of listening into this conversation. What is your understanding of whether or not data localization will actually help enhance security?
So, we're the world's largest security firm, and traditionally, we help clients understand risk, threats, and find solutions to mitigate those threats. Traditionally, the threats have been external and physical in nature. So from physical threats to terrorism and whatnot. In the last 10 years plus, the threats have moved from physical to digital. And I'm not talking about cybersecurity here. That is just the one element of it. And they've moved internal. So the organizations have bigger threats sitting inside the organization which can disrupt their businesses, create all kinds of risks which are not related to an outside attack. But because of the conflicts, some of the data policies can create between the employees who are the generators of income and the organizations. And then the impact of those internal threats, because of the data regulations, whether it's a corporate level or a sovereign level, can create significant impacts on the outcomes of that organization, which is either earnings to the shareholders and whatnot. Now, so for us to help our clients first to understand that risk and mitigate, lack of regulation or ambiguity is the disastrous thing. So I'm not saying whether there should be more regulation or less, but to understand what are the rules of the game gives you a framework to understand those risks. So whilst I agree with Bipin, and I'm a capitalist as well, no regulation will make it better, but I think it'll just create chaos for us to understand that risk. And quickly making a second point, and Arvind is sitting here and a good friend, and he says he's not part of the government, but he's a great influencer. Having lived in China and India, I think there is merit in what they do. So when we talk about data localization, and I think it's been said several times here, I don't think that is a big issue. The bigger issue really is, I think Ashutosh mentioned about metadata and what the data does. And unfortunately, most of the regulations, especially in Asia and Africa, which I think are the most underdeveloped in terms of regulation, the biggest issue is they're still tackling some of the very basic building blocks. Guess what? Even if you didn't tackle them, they're not going to create the biggest risk or opportunity. Bigger risk and opportunity lies in what you do to what happens after the basic building blocks are stored and wherever they're stored. And I just want to end on because we've talked about the oil analogy, my analogy for data is slightly different. I think it's akin to stem cells. So what you do today with data, you have no idea. For 100 years, 50 years from now, some smart kids, what could they do with that data? That could transform the world or end it. So I think the onus on the governments and the regulators today is significant. We're trying to solve today's problem and trying to address tomorrow's opportunity. That's what we're doing in this regulation. And we're solving tomorrow's opportunity because there are a lot of economic interests for entrepreneurs and unicorns and whatnot. I think governments have a bigger responsibility of forming regulation which keeps this mojo intact and in good shape for 50 years so that time, if someone can think of something that can be done with this data, can this transform the world?
Thanks. Yes, please go ahead.
Sorry,
if you could
yes.
just introduce yourself.
I will, certainly. Trevor Bull, Aviva Life Insurance, India. I just wanted to disrupt because there's nice, perfect questions go around to different people. What I'm interested in, and being a little bit silverhead, I've been through many regulatory changes in the world, where there's consumer rights, and then there's insurance and banking, and regulations there to protect customers, myself included. But it got to stages in the history where it became prescriptive, then principle with lots of layers. And eventually, as we all made things simpler, the regulations required a lot more data. So where I only needed 5 signatures insurance, suddenly the regulations, to fulfill the regulations, I had to add another 40 questions to make sure the customer understands. So the buying journey got more complicated through regulation. What I'm interested in digital, it makes things so simple. Today in the UK, my group company Aviva can offer you an insurance product for your household insurance without one question being asked. All we know is your name and postcode. Bang, here's your insurance. Don't ask any questions. But we need to protect data and privacy. Privacy then needs consent. So suddenly, an insurance product which has got to 0 questions could suddenly be 0 questions, but here's 20 questions for your consent. And it destroys the simplification of digital. Digital just makes life easy. Yeah, it's simple, fast, convenient. And I'm wondering, and there's the education you mentioned earlier, sir, about consent and education. I have 20-year-old children who don't bother. They get a new phone or upgrade. They never look at settings. They just download any app. They trust the phone's been set correctly, and they just leave their data alone. I have 25-year-old Indian employees. Again, they download any app. They get a phone. They never look at the settings. I've met CEOs of technical companies in India who themselves admit they never check the settings on their phones. So given that level of, I don't know, apathy about settings on phones, and therefore letting the big companies have it, yet making sure we don't make consent or regulations so onerous that it destroys the whole speed of digital, where's that middle ground? How do you still in today not make mistakes of the past with regulation, not add regulation which makes the buying process onerous, but still protects people?
That's a great question, and actually I'm going to put it to Nicholas. Yeah, Nicholas, how do we empower people and citizens to use data responsibly?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, great topic. Consent. If you take an insurance company and the metadata that we were speaking about earlier, I think metadata absolutely has to be more regulated, but the idea that it is easier and better to send that outside of a market versus the raw data, I totally disagree with. Because actually it's that metadata that will power the intelligence that results on the effect on an individual more than the data itself. And in respect to the insurance industry, a health tech business that has access to the raw data of a health service in a market, they may create a cure for kidney cancer. But if that health tech startup is bought by an insurance company, that same technology will be used to discriminate against the very people that would have otherwise be helped by it in order to put their prices for insurance up. So actually, the use of data, and whether it's a good or a bad use, is relative to the individual and the specific use case. And with respect to consent, because I think consent does form a core part of this, as I mentioned in my talk yesterday, I think consent in its current form is dead, because as a number of people have spoken about, people cannot understand what they're consenting to anymore. But more specifically, if machine learning enables a device to know more about you than you know about yourself, without you ever having to have had to give it consent in order to know that, where does consent even factor into this? And this idea that simply removing consent or like the encumbrance of the hassle in order to give consent, I think is farcical. You need to look beyond what consent is designed to do. Consent is designed to stop an individual being discriminated against, to have their privacy infringed. And actually, in order for regulation to go forwards, I think you really need to go way, way back to simple fundamentals of human rights and philosophy. And the biggest issue in data and the future of data is that there's so many people focusing on the technology and not the principles of society that we're missing out on the most fundamental parts. And on the investment side, I really feel like actually, and the foundation of People.io, which is effectively the visa of data, helping individuals transact data from one place to another in a way that is controlled and safe, I actually think the future of innovation won't be stifled by the availability of financial capital, but more by the availability of data in order to power the products and services that the innovators will create. And by not breaking up big tech in the valley, what you inevitably end up with is a reflection of where 98% of global wealth is held by 1% of the global population. You will very quickly enter a space where 98% of global intelligence is held by 1% of the global tech companies. And that will result in a seismic shift of society that no one state or even multiple continents will be able to shift. So I think the opportunity of people having ownership and the control of data is so significant, but not just for individuals, but for the commercial interests of businesses as well.
Bipin, yeah, I'd be interested too.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to respond to what the topic that Trevor had raised, which is about as Indians, we install any app and, give consent to anything and everything. And that is true. And in fact, that is the reason why we need a data privacy structure, right? India has seen in the last 3 years or maybe 5 years, the fastest growth of any economy in the digital space in terms of people getting connected through smartphones, getting access to internet, getting access to cheap data. And hey, I mean, all of these customers are new to internet, right? And because they are new to internet, right, their first reaction is that of trust, right? Which is that we install any app, we trust big brands, and we trust what is being conveyed. But that necessarily doesn't mean that we don't need an architecture for the next phase of growth, where as many of these customers, many of these consumers become more aware, more mature in an internet society, they will definitely want to have a structure where they can control their data, and which is why I think it's very, very timely. I mean, India has been, I think nothing from this panel should take away the fact that India has been probably the most open digital economy anywhere in the world, right? And which is what has resulted in this explosion of data. And I think therefore time is right now to start addressing the data privacy issue.
Just adding to the point what Trevor has mentioned, there's a big debate that's happening. Is data protection law killing artificial intelligence? And what I mean by that, there's a thin line what Ron has mentioned about having ethics in artificial intelligence and having an innovation-prone society and entrepreneurs coming forward and doing something more tangible. We're an AI research company out of Mumbai. We've been working on deep facial model for last 3.5 years. We have an application that probably relates to Aviva in one way or the other. By looking at photographs, we can tell whether you're a smoker or non-smoker. Now, that would save a tremendous amount of money for Aviva, not spending on Cortinine test for 700 or 800 rupees or $150 in US or in UK. Now, how do we really define ethics and innovation? And how do we draw a line? Should we go for such innovations or not? Or should we just get bounded by ethical laws? So the real question is that, the data protection law, are we creating the policies? Are these future ready?
I want to try and address that. Not that I have an idea of exactly how it's going to play out from what Manoj mentioned. And of course, Nick also mentioned a lot of risks that are going on. But I think it's very important for all of us to understand and re-establish our fundamental relationship with the first digital device that we communicate with the external world with, right? And understand what we can expect out of that digital device as well. The solutions, the middle ground to what Trevor is asking about in terms of consent, is not going to be technology or tools or regulation. It's an idea that has been mentioned before. It's going to be about fundamentally of privacy by design. And design has to contextualize within the culture of any geography where it's being applied to, right? Hence, it is imperative for strong industry expert collaboration, policymakers to come together and establish this awareness to the consumers and also the burden of consumers to understand when they're giving data away, to what purpose are they giving away, and once the law is in place, they have to understand that it is their imperative to protect themselves against the wrongdoings as well. And I think the world has set enough precedence in being able to provide that foundation for the global citizens as well.
I think someone has a question. We have like 5. Yeah, go ahead. Can somebody just pass on a mic to him, please? No. Let's just get you a mic. Give us 20 seconds.
Sorry, the question will be a bit long. So I work for BT with Larry, and I've been working for BT for a few years. And BT has been holding consumer personal data for about 200 years now, ever since telecom was invented. So we are really proud of our track record on that. And my question for all successful leaders here is, I think we talk about artificial intelligence, but I think real intelligence, for example, personally, at the moment, I feel very comfortable and secure about my passport because it is in my personal possession. I only take it out when I travel, and I never give it to social networking. So I feel really safe about my passport. Anything else, my email, my first name, my last name, my date of birth, my address is quite available. I know that, even if I try to hide it and secure it. So isn't it, rather than looking at government to set policy and structure, do we think industry should take more leadership? And rather than, if rather than leaving it to a consumer to decide what is private and what is not provided, because some of the people, especially in rural India, may not be able to make that decision, right? So isn't it for the industry to take some leadership saying these 8 or 10 attributes of a person are actually private, and we make a commitment now, like Apple is doing it to some extent, is that we will never ever share this anywhere. So, and I think what happens is, like, if we let it go too far, if growth of anything is unhindered, then it normally leads to ill effects, like diesel cars, like petrol, all of that, plastic, right? And then we look at policy to put it in control. So can industry not take leadership, saying that, and that is why the question for everybody here is long range
Nicholas
probably.
Wants to, yeah, he has an answer for you.
Yeah, very briefly, we actually launched with Telefonica in Germany to solve that specific issue, because telco as an industry is obviously one of the industries most being hurt by the likes of Facebook and Google, specifically because of the regulation that sits in and around it. And so what we actually did was launch the People.io product on top of Telefonica's infrastructure. So effectively, all of the data that is flowing through the Telefonica network can actually be transitioned into the control of a user. So now all of your geographic data about cell location, whether it's real time or 12 months of historic, the user within 5 seconds can now benefit from a geospatial profile of the last 12 months of their life. That's data that you could never have used as the telco because of the regulation that structures around it. But now the benefit to a user, if you log into Rightmove or any other service that needs location data, can be exponentially better. And I think industry certainly plays a significant role in doing that, but industry first needs to accept that they cannot be the ones to try and collect more data. They need to relinquish the control to the user in order for the industry to move forward. Because no industry, whether it's insurance, telco, finance, healthcare, none of them in their own vertical will compete with Google, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, etc. They simply will not. And any industry that continues to persist in that view will slow down. If you relinquish the control and work across industries and unify together, that's where I think the industry absolutely should be leading the way.
Okay, I'm afraid I've completely run out of time. I've got last 2 minutes. And so, Richard, I'm going to sort of, you set the stage for the discussion. It's only fair you sort of concluded. I think a lot of us here also want to know, in a post-Brexit world, how is the India-UK collaboration to encash on this digital opportunity going to look like?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. First and foremost, I say that the discussion that we've had today has been absolutely fascinating. Look, if you look at data and its impact at the moment, it impacts on 25% of the global GDP at this very moment in time, and that is only going to increase because the impact of digitalization and data is all pervasive and increasing. So I think the key thing that in a post-Brexit environment, I mean, just looking into the future, Brexit or no Brexit, is how can we collaborate as in a way that actually makes sense and is additive to the future. I think Ron made a fantastic point in relation to research collaboration and collaboration in terms of the AI capabilities of the UK, upstream AI capabilities of the UK, the data that's going to become increasingly available in India, plus the research capabilities, I think really is the way forward. And I'm very, very interested in the announcements that we've seen from Prime Minister Modi about the establishment of an AI institute in Bangalore. And just this week, if not maybe last week, we saw the announcement from my alma mater, University of Oxford, that they are going to be creating a new college, postgraduate college in Oxford, focused on AI and development. So clearly there are nexuses between the two countries that should be established within the context of already established dialogues, be that in JETCO, be that in the CEO Forum, be that in Newton Baba Fund, where research collaborations are encouraged. So from that context, I think all the elements are in place to actually take and develop a really strong relationship.
Right. Thank you. And with that, I'd like to thank each one of you. Thank you so much for patiently lending us your ears. I do hope that this discussion was worth your while. Thanks so much.